In number 3, we're also going to do a chi-squared test again, but we're also in parts A and B going to explore some informal methods for determining whether there's association between two categorical variables. So let me take a minute and talk about that. So a chi-squared test is a statistical test. It's a formal, so we call it a formal method of determining whether two variables are associated, right? It gives us a sort of scientific answer, a conclusive answer as to whether, for example here, whether your gender and what your dominant hand is. But sometimes before we go that far, before we do all the steps of a chi-square test, because it's a slightly complicated process, we might want to explore some informal methods to make a more rough hypothesis as to whether there's a relationship between these two variables. And two informal methods that we have are making a graph, and I'll talk about that in a sec, or by making a table with relative frequencies. So let's start with the graph. So when we're dealing with categorical data and we want to use a graph to determine whether our two variables are related, the graph that we want to use is called a side-by-side bar chart. And it's just like it sounds. You're going to make a bar chart. You're going to make two bar charts, and they're going to be side by side. So in this case, our example is we have two genders here, male and female, and we want to see whether there's an association between these genders and what your dominant hand is, whether you're right or left-handed. So we want to see, if we want to see whether these genders and your dominant hand are related, what we really want to ask is are these two distributions very different? Is the distribution of right versus left-handed for men very different from the distribution for women? Because if they're very different, for example, if a lot more men are right-handed than women, that tells me that there's probably some relationship between whether you're male and whether you're right-handed. On the other hand, if these two distributions are very similar, then there probably is not a relationship. So we can use the side-by-side bar chart to figure that out. So I'll make a bar chart for each row of our data set. Our two rows here are male and female. And I'm just going to make a bar for the frequencies of right and left-handedness. So let's see. I'll draw a 50 up here and a 10 down here. We have 43 right-handed men. So 43 is about here, I'll say. And then I'll draw a bar for left-handedness in men. There's 9 left-handed men, so I'll draw a bar about yay high. Oops, for left. And write 9 in there. Let's do the same for women. So there were 44 right-handed females in our study, so that bar should be about yay high. And 4 left-handed women, so that should be about yay high. Oops, I've got these mixed up. This should be right, and this should be left. And so now I have my side-by-side bar chart, and I want to go back to that question I was mentioning earlier. I want to see, is this distribution, do these two bars look very different from these two bars? In other words, is the relationship much different for men versus women? And the answer is no. You know, these two bars look a lot like these two bars in terms of how high they are. So from this, we can see that there doesn't seem to be any relationship between these two genders and dominant hand. So that's our first informal method. We can see that drawing this bar chart was a lot quicker and less computationally intensive than doing our chi-square test. So our next informal method is making a conditional contingency table with relative frequencies. That's a whole lot of words. All we're doing is we're taking this table, and this table has absolute counts, right? They're just counts. All we're going to change these into is relative frequencies. So in other words, I want to see how many were right-handed relative to the total number of men. So I'll divide every number here by the row total. So for example, here, the second one, I want to see how many were right or left-handed relative to the total number of women. So I need to calculate the row totals. In other words, how many men were there and how many women? So there were 43 plus 9 men, so 52 men. And there were 44 plus 4 women, so 48 women. So now we have our totals. So I'm just going to make this table again. Male, female. And now, instead of just absolute counts, I'm going to take relative counts. So I'm going to take 43 and divide it by 52. If I convert that to a decimal, 43 divided by 52 is about 0.83. 9 divided by 52 is about 0.17. Then 44 divided by the total number of women, which is 48. 44 over 48 is 0.92 approximately, and 4 divided by 48 is 0.08. So I can see that 83% of men were right-handed, 17% of men were left-handed, 92% of women were right-handed, and 8% of women were left-handed. So again, the same question I want to ask, just like in the side-by-side bar chart, is I want to ask, is the distribution of right versus left-handedness for men very different than the one for women? And well, I can see that the majority of men, the vast majority of men were right-handed. The vast majority of women were also right-handed. And, a very small percentage, or a pretty small percentage, less than 20%, were left-handed. So in other words, there doesn't seem to be a big difference in these two trends. So I can conclude the same thing. There doesn't seem to be any relationship between your gender and whether you're right or left-handed. So those are our two informal methods, a graph and a conditional frequency table. Lastly, we can confirm our informal conclusions. We can confirm whether our conclusions are correct by doing a formal chi-square test. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'll clear some space here. Let's go ahead and do our chi-square test. Remember, the first thing we want to do is make our claim. So our claim, like always, is there's no relationship between our two variables. So our claim here should be there's no relationship between being male and female and your dominant hand. Okay, so then we want to check all of our assumptions. So we want to check first, well, I'll write this down. We want to check, do we have count data? Is our data of the correct type? Well, these are definitely counts. They're not like measurements of like inches, height, weight, or anything. Just counts. So I'll give this a check. Our next two conditions are independence and randomization. Well, randomization, we're told in this problem that our 100 people in our study were randomly chosen from the population. They were randomly sampled. So that checks off this assumption, randomization. So we're good there. Independence typically is something we assume is true unless we're told otherwise. Our last assumption that we need to check is, are the expected cell counts each greater than 5? Well, so let's go ahead and calculate our expected cell counts. Remember that the expected cell counts, our formula for that, for each cell, I'll write E for expected counts. To find the expected count for each cell, we take the row total times the column total and divide by the grand total. So conveniently, we've already found the row totals. So let's go ahead and write down the column totals. 43 plus 44, let's do some mental math. That should be 87. 9 plus 4 is 13. And then our grand total, well, it told us we had 100 people. If you add up 43, 9, 44, and 4, you should get 100. Okay, so we have our row and column totals and our grand total. So now we can go ahead and find the expected counts. I'm going to write them in blue in our table. As a reminder, we refer to our data that were given, 43, 9, 44, and 4. These are what we call the observed counts, and what we're going to calculate are called the expected counts. So let's first do the cell. So the row total here is 52, the column total is 87, and my grand total is 100. If I take 87 times 52 divided by 100, I should get 45.24. So I'll write 45.24 right here. Next, 52 times 13 divided by 100, we should get 6.76. We plug that into our calculator. Let's go here. 48 times 87 divided by 100, we should get 41.76. Last, 48 times 13 divided by 100, we should get 6.24. And now we have our expected counts. So now we can go to our next step, which is to calculate our chi-squared value. Remember, our chi-squared value we find by, for each cell, we take the observed count, subtract the expected count, square it, divide it by the expected count. Do that for each cell, calculate this fraction, and then add all of those quantities up. So we're going to sum over all the cells, in other words. So I'll go cell by cell. First cell, I want to do 43 minus 45.24, square that, divided by 45.24. Then I want to do, let's see, for my next cell, 9 minus 6.76 squared, divided by 6.76. I go to my third cell, which is right here, 44 minus 41.76 squared divided by 41.76. And then last, I take my last cell in my table and I do 4 minus 6.24 squared over 6.24. And then I just need to plug this into my calculator and calculate it all out. If I do that, I should get 1.777. Here, I'll just round that to 1.78. And that's my chi-squared value. So my next step, or really my second to last step, before I can make my conclusion is, now I need to take this and find my p-value. To do that, you would use Minitab. You would plug in your data into Minitab, and it'll tell you the p-value. We have a lab and a homework assignment about how to use Minitab to do that. For the sake of this, I have plugged this into Minitab, and so I'll tell you the p-value. The p-value for a chi-squared value of 1.78 is 0.182. So lastly, to make our conclusion, we want to compare this p-value to 0.05. If this p-value is less than 0.05, if it's less than 5%, we should reject our claim. And if it is not less than if it's not less than 0.05, if it's not small, then we should fail to reject our claim. Well, we can see that 18% is definitely greater than 5%. So our conclusion is, since our p-value is greater than 0.05, since 0.182 is greater than 0.18, since 0.182 is greater than 0.05, we should fail to reject our claim. In other words, we should conclude that there is in fact no relationship between what gender you are and what your dominant hand is. And that is our final conclusion. I just want to go back for a second because I forgot to go back and verify this last claim. So let's go back and make sure this last assumption is true. Well, our expected counts are 45 something, 41 something, 6 something, and 6 something. So all of these are greater than 5. So we're good. And that is our chi-squared test.